Okay, let's do this thing. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Chris Grobe. I am one of the co-directors of the Theater and Performance Studies seminar here at the Mahindra Center. And I'm delighted to have the honor today of introducing Sydney Skybetter and his talk, Clock Fall. I always say I introduce the occasion as much as the person. So for those of you who don't know Sydney, he's an associate professor of theater and performance studies and deputy dean of the college at Brown. Calls himself a choreoroboticist, a term you might hear more about in this talk. But I first met Sydney, I think, at a meeting of something called the Critical Practices Unit. I'll give you some time to think about that acronym, at Stanford, a community of people which suited him perfectly in that it brought scholars and artists and engineers together in one room to have one conversation together. And that's the kind of space that Sydney likes to inhabit. That's the kind of space he likes to create. First, as founder of something called the Conference for Research on Choreographic Interfaces, most recently as the host of a podcast called Dances with Robots. And I'm really excited to have him here today at Harvard in the Boston area to talk about his work on dance and robotics. And I'm particularly interested to know more at this distance from Silicon Valley about what the prospects look like from here out east. I know that among his many other qualifications and activities, Sydney has also spoken at and consulted with Boston Dynamics, our sort of one of our local outposts of the social robotics industry. So that's what it means to me to have Sydney here, someone who creates unique spaces for conversations around the arts and emerging technologies, and who, in that capacity, is a really strong and tireless advocate for the arts and for arts knowledge as something that belongs in these spaces, although on what terms it belongs is always an unsettled and unsettling thing. So without any further ado, Sydney Skybetter talking about Clock Fall. Thanks.
Greetings, nerds. First, I want to say that I'm grateful to you all for showing up, both actually and virtually. And I need to thank, of course, Noe, Kyle, Christopher, Linz, the Mahindra Humanities Center, Meta Lab, and the whole crew, the production crew here at Harvard for producing this event. I'm grateful for all of your efforts. My name is Sydney Skybetter. I'm a choreographer and the deputy dean of the college at Brown University, which occupies a swath of unceded Narragansett land and was built with the hands of and wealth generated by enslaved labor. Now, for everyone's collective reference, if you'd like to follow along, read my remarks after the fact, or view these videos again, you can check out skybetter.org/clockfall. The entirety of my lecture and keynote media are available there. Tonight is dedicated to my partner, Leticia, who looks very nice today. Let us begin. In 2022, a film came out called M3GAN, about an artificially intelligent robot who predictably loses her marbles and goes on a homicidal rampage. In one narratively inexplicable scene, she does this gymnastic, vaguely lascivious dance before murdering a dude with a paper cutter. This filmic moment, like the garbage compactor scene in Star Wars, like Jack's death in Titanic, is simultaneously iconic and nonsensical. It just doesn't make any goddamned sense. But that didn't stop it from burning brightly across the zeitgeist. People riffed on M3GAN dances for months. They made appearances at NFL games. It took over TikTok. The self-serious goofitude of a murderous dancing robot was for a gleaming moment everywhere. Now, upon viewing this, you can perhaps imagine hundreds of journalists across the country, all simultaneously, each one desperately trying to make sense of the cultural logic of this, and then all simultaneously Googling dancing robot murder expert and being pleasantly surprised to learn that, in fact, there is an expert in dancing robot murder, and he's a professor at Brown. Because, of course, he's a professor at Brown. So, true story. Around this time, 2 years ago, I started getting emails and phone calls, and sometimes news crews just kind of showing up at my office. This is the image that NBC used to represent me as a credible source on the subject of my life's work and research specialty. This slide shows me interviewed, wearing a lavender sweatshirt exquisitely paired with a matching face of incredulity as I lack media training and did not understand what was happening. My hair looks floofy as a Maine Coon in a Tesla coil, and the Chiron names me as Sydney Skybetter, Deputy Dean of Brown University's College for Curriculum, which is not a thing. Now, thankfully, you should know that the part of my brain that enables the capacity to feel embarrassment or shame burned off years ago as a result of a lifetime of being a professional artist. As such, I'm here today to talk about choreorobotics, which of course is a portmanteau of choreography and robotics. Now, to be an etymology ass clown for just a moment, the word choreography is a contraction of a Greek root, chorea, as in chorus, meaning altogether dancing, and an English suffix, graphy, meaning to write or encode. The word robot, meanwhile, is derived from the Czech, robota, meaning forced labor or slave. And so, in the subfield of choreorobotics, we are definitionally concerned with how bodies move and how those bodies are encoded, and how the resulting performances interface with power. So, dancing murder robots, basically, is my field of research. Choreorobotics is, I recently promised my tenure committee, totally 100% definitely a thing. It is also totally 100% definitely a word that a gaggle of us very recently made up. If nothing else, choreorobotics as an interdisciplinary intervention at the intersection of choreographic theory and robotic motion planning offers a rich, critical aperture to consider how bodies in motion, human or otherwise, move through space and time to generate meaning. I've been obsessed with bodies, choreography, robots, and violence for a long time. This is the earliest known video of my dancing. I'm approximately 10 years old, and this is the living room of the house that my family rented on a clover farm some 30 rural minutes away from Fort Wayne, Indiana. I seem to, laughter at Fort Wayne, Indiana, yes. I seem to be wearing jeggings rolled up in the style of capris, have what appears to be a black eye, and tote a hairstyle very much in the shape of the bowl used to cut it. I'm dancing to my favorite musical at the time, a chorus line, and seem to be improvising with repetitive deployment of my favorite moves from the tumble bus dance classes I would have been taking around then. Now, I largely grew up in the Midwest at a moment when being a boy who danced was a positionally risky thing. My nascent engagement with ballet was read as queer, and neither my smallness nor meekness allayed the resulting violences. I was bullied a lot, called expletives from passing cars, shoved into lockers, and punched in the back of the head at football games. Now, my intention in airing this bit of trauma is to observe how dance and violence have always been linked in my embodied experience. This makes sense, too, from a dance historical perspective. The Western dance tradition arguably starts in colonial French courts, and ballet, as historian Jennifer Homans puts it, was for most of the 18th century an adjunct martial art, used tactically to augment courtiers' training in fencing and equestrianism. Ballet and violence have mutually constituted one another for centuries. Louis XIV, the arguable originator of the balletic form, used both dance and emerging technologies of dance notation as an explicitly colonial form of cultural propaganda, which Napoleon perfected by taking ballet dancers on conquests to North Africa, which in turn shaped the plot of the original Nutcracker, which is an allegory of Napoleonic alliances, violences, and dance styles, which became the most popular ballet of all time and, not coincidentally, tells the story of a machine that comes alive to dance and do murder. Nailed it. In this fashion, my work today on dancing murder robots is simply a logical extension of the deep dance historical weirdness that came before. Weirdness that provides useful vantage to understand contemporary media like this. About 2 years ago, Elon Musk took the stage at the Tesla AI conference to announce recent progress from their Optimus bipedal robotics program. After introductory remarks, Musk brought on stage a dancer dressed like a robo-minion from the then-recent film The Mitchells vs. the Machines. Bear in mind, The Mitchells vs. the Machines is literally a satire of Elon Musk. This human acting like a robot enters the space as a robot stereotypically might, with stiff limbs reminiscent of Daft Punk music videos. But then, out of nowhere, the dancer-slash-robot performs a series of movements originating specifically from the Black performance tradition. I wanted to make sure I wasn't horrifically misreading what was happening here, so I called up Professor Monsell Durden at USC. He's an ethnochoreologist and an expert in African-American dance history. We watched the video together a few times.
I could name them specifically, but everything before that is really terrible jazz.
Okay.
Like terrible jazz. Absolutely terrible.
He confirmed that there's some Charleston, some shaggy jazz with Broadway inflections, some two-stepping, and most saliently, a cakewalk. Now, the cakewalk, as Black feminist dance theorist Brenda Dixon Gothschild might remind us, is a minstrel dance that originates in the 19th century within Black and enslaved communities that literally satirizes white antebellum ball culture. There are stories from the pre-Civil War South, of enslaved folks competing to perform the most exaggerated effete prances, often with plantation owners serving as judges. These stylized, silly walks were so popular that white folks incorporated them into minstrel acts and antebellum socials, performing movements that they thought were the epitome of Blackness, but that Black folks had created as a carnivalesque mockery of white power. After a minute of this, Musk seems to get bored or irritated and shoos the dancer off stage. He then goes on to talk about how we, his presumed audience of technocratic elites, don't need to worry about robot uprisings because his robots are going to be friendly. Musk promises that by dint of our superior strength, speed, and intelligence, we will always be able to overpower any robot rebellion. Recall here again that the root word of robot is slave. This is an example of what the kids call a self-own, and an object lesson in what theorist and co-curator of the series, Christopher Grobe, calls bot face, roughly the use of robotic performance to reify and extend the violent appropriation of Blackness into emergent technological domains using the racist logic of blackface. All of this should be placed within a more general performance context, namely that Elon Musk is a troll. I mean that personally, in that he's an amply documented sexual predator with a fondness for anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories about white genocide. But I also mean that characterologically, as a means to understand his personal, fiduciary, and performative priorities. As a troll, he proudly and deliberately orchestrates his sizable online presence towards controversy. Earlier this year, Musk, on the nosedly, changed his official Twitter bio to CTO, or Chief Troll Officer, a role suitable for the owner of a platform that monetizes hate speech. Trolling and minstrelsy are reinforcing performative stanchions, and now this dysregulated, flukish dancing makes for weird internet news and modulated meanings across differentiated audiences. To tech journalists, it's a goofy joke aimed at a Tesla competitor, Boston Dynamics. To Musk's Red Pillar fan base, it's a comment about us being smarter and more capable than robots, and the robots, to be clear, are being coded as Black. And to those who'd criticize overt racism in Silicon Valley, well, where are you going to post your cute little comments if not on Twitter? Any controversy, agreement, or disagreement draws attention to Tesla and enriches Musk personally. It's a tidy Ouroboros of swampy surveillance capitalism, a performance where critics enrich and sustain the very thing they seek to resist. And yet, because trolling is such a haphazard, hasty pudding of a critical stance, this shaggy performance maintains unlikely traces of resistance. The dance is so overtly derivative that its ideological and aesthetic dark matter remain present, material that might have been cloaked in a more thoughtful presentation. Racial anxieties writing citational checks that Musk can't cash. Within this overtly racist performance are nonetheless stories in descent, stories of resisting anti-blackness that came before. It suggests that some bodies in descent have a longer half-life than might be pessimistically presupposed, that someone performed a cakewalk at a party thrown by Elon Musk could be read as trolling the Wehrmacht Erlkönig. And so while Musk remains the richest man in the world or whatever, dancing just a few feet from him is a black-coated robot throwing ancestral shade. At the following year's Tesla AI conference, Musk showed off heavily edited footage of Optimus, walking constipatedly around while narrating how its operating system is a transferable AI, an intelligence that can be relocated from robotic body to body, agnostic as to whether that embodiment is a bipedal robot or car or truck or otherwise. This suggests AIs will access different expressive registers depending on what form of embodiment they occupy. If robots are an expressive articulation of artificial intelligences, which themselves are algorithmic manifestations of the biases of their designers and training data, then the racist hierarchies of AI-powered robots can be observed through their movement, dance, and gesture. Consider then what it means for Elon Musk, a man with the moral character and aesthetic complexity of a Gordita Crunchwrap, to talk about the future of labor while wearing an illustration of two robot hands forming a heart. Musk's obsession with robots, dance, and misogyny has been noted by all manner of internet cretins and resulted in some deeply weird dancerly rat holes. Here's an AI-generated image of Musk with a fembot apparently named Catnilla, as posted by internet person Daniel Marvin, who kicked off a truly world-class archipelago of incel expressivity and fervid fantasizing that Musk was secretly designing the perfect dancing robot wife. This was, in fact, very much not a thing, and had to be debunked again and again on Reddit, Business Insider, and a bunch of other platforms by pointing to the original illustrator slash prompt engineer slash, this is true, dance teacher, Diana Stark. Now, I read this Pygmalionic internet faff to understand how embodied AIs relate to audience reception, performance, and power. Hold on to your butts. Tesla, of course, recently released the Cybertruck, a militarized refrigerator on wheels that looks like it was designed by someone who did just a ton of cocaine and then tried and failed to draw a rectangle from memory. The Cybertruck, like other Tesla late models, ships with functionality called dance mode or party mode, a bit of software that enables users to choreograph to music their vehicle's lights and the movement of windows, fuel cap, mirrors, trunks, and frunks, as in front trunk. It's a thing. Now, a bit of a reframe is useful here. Musk says that Tesla is one of the largest manufacturers of robots on the planet because, he argues, Tesla cars are robots. This is like the one thing that Elon Musk and I agree on, that robots are computational systems with sensory apparatuses, no matter the form factor. It's an important semantic frame that suggests choreorobotic performances need be situated neither in human nor humanoid embodiment. I'm trying to understand why Tesla encourages owners to daisy-chain their vehicles together to perform car de ballets such as this one. There have been hundreds of these performances, and Tesla has actually commissioned many of them. The most famous are choreographed by a guy whose internet handle is HVPad, who was engaged by Tesla last Christmas to create this quasi-holiday-themed sensory blitzkrieg. Observe, these 5 crimson Cybertrucks facing the camera, dramatically framed by a series of Tron red trusses bisected by perpendicular fluorescence. The top of each truck is bound by 2 horizontal strips of light, the top extending a smooth beam from truck left to truck right. These LEDs are capable of smooth variance and the appearance of flowing illumination. This pentagony of Cybertrucks creates a rippling visual field staged to fill the entirety of the parking lot that contains them, and demonstrates a capacity to synchronize piercing lights to tacky, self-serious music. The vibe serves policing realness, the trucks composing a phalanx of armor and penetratingly asymmetric visuality that brings to mind propaganda such as Knight Rider. and RoboCop, but without those franchises' irony and campy self-awareness. An aesthetic perhaps best described as Stand Your Ground Laws meets musical theater summer camp. In this aesthetic vein, it's perhaps not surprising that Tesla maintains active contracts with police forces around the world, ranging from Ciudad Valles to Dubai, and that before the Cybertruck was even released to the public, Oracle, which does police stuff apparently, was already planning on manufacturing a version with extra aggressive Tron styling for cops. Teslas aren't just for policing though, of course. Their dance functionality indicates they're also, you know, for kids. When Disney's Encanto was released in 2021, it inspired a series of homebrew garage-staged performances. This is my personal illustrative favorite, Surface Pressure, also choreographed by HV Pad. Observe the deployment of theatrical lighting and cornerstone of the contemporary dance trade, the smoke machine. This particular performance is conventional of the Tesla medium. There are musically coordinated movements of the fuel cap, mirrors, and side windows, and sometimes the trunk and frunk get into it. The light show is the primary attentional draw, but the presence, movement, and/or stillness of car components form the robotic embodiment through which a musical visualization is staged. Reading car parts through dance theory has limits. One of the dominant theorizations of how choreographies create meaning is through mirror neuronal metakinesthetic empathy. It goes something like this. I, someone with ballet training, go to a ballet show. I see a dancer performing a movement I recognize, let's say a fouette. Now, I've done lots of fouettes. They looked exactly like this. And I have a visceral sense memory of what my body feels while spinning. Now, when I see someone else fouette, the mirror neurons in my brain fire as though I'm the one doing it. I sense in someone else's movements my own embodied history. The dancerly architecture of my aesthetic sensibilities, what I find meaningful, is preconditioned on embodied experience and the ability to empathically project onto others. Kinesthetic empathy usefully demonstrates the sheer disjuncture of meaning-making potential between a human body in performance and the robotic enclosure of an AI such as this Tesla. I cannot empathize with a window closing or a frunk opening. This Tesla body is too unlike mine to be interesting for long, which perhaps explains why choreorobotic artists like Katie Kwan and Huang Yi and Merritt Moore and Beyoncé perform their dances with robots to accommodate an audience's nominal interest in a robot by itself. Now, the limited applicability of kinesthetic empathy also explains why so many of these performances drift towards scale and spectacle. Indeed, there are regional syndicates of Tesla owners with performance proclivities, resulting in an impressively diverse gamut of kitsch and a burgeoningly global proto-fascist choreorobotic aesthetic. Consider this performance, produced a few months ago by an Israeli Tesla accessory store that brought together a world record-breaking 700 Teslas to, in their word, shout the cry of the kidnapped men and women in the captivity of Hamas. Now, this is one of many such performances. The mass spectacleization of choreorobotics brings to mind the movement choirs of Leni Riefenstahl and Albert Speer's Lichtung. The use of a luxury car as a robotic performance apparatus also illustrates some of the ideological limitations of the form. It's hard to imagine Tesla dances for progressive causes. Assuming each of these 700 Teslas is worth an average of $25,000 per, and I think that a low estimate, the baseline production cost for this bit of colonial propaganda starts at approximately $17,500,000. So, sure, cars have always been marketed and sold to extend their owner's sense of identity. We've been trained under capitalism to understand our vehicles as an extension of ourselves, a cyborgian performative proboscis that Musk's Teslas take to an extreme by shipping cars with end-user choreorobotic performance software. This is documentation of Tesla's dance functionality from GitHub. With a little Python, you can create a script that will sync your lights and the opening and closing of your Falcon doors to any piece of music you upload to your car on a thumb drive. There's also a rudimentary interface that shows the waveform of the dance track with sliders and checkboxes indicating what parts of the car you want to move, in what sequence, and for what duration. It's a little like GarageBand, but for car dancing. Now, one of the facets of my research at Brown is choreographic interfaces, the computational means for emergent choreographic production. So I think about how software enables dances to be made, whether those dances are embodied by people or machines, because in this context, the design of software determines what gets to be called a dance, and what the component repertories, grammars, and declensions of that dance can even be. Now, this is where interface analysis and dance studies get cozy. When we consider, echoing performance theorist Joseph Roach, that aesthetics and interfaces are ideological formations that contend simultaneously with what an observer already understands about power and what a designer aims to communicate about culture. Tesla's vehicular razzle-dazzle points to a predominant choreorobotic norm, that the platforms deployable for performance exist coterminously with misogynistic tech bro goblin culture, as well as numerous flavors of anti-black and anti-brown violence. Indeed, much of choreorobotic creative production can be keenly framed in the context of military dual use. Consider the inevitable deployment of the Cybertruck's lights to alert or disorient onlookers by police forces, and then those same lights being used to musically visualize your favorite song by Coldplay. And scene. I am drawn to the gnarliest braids of emergent choreographic phenomena because I want to understand how dance history's violent entanglements perpetuate themselves. And thus, I want to understand how those entanglements can be resisted and reversed. The means of dance-early production at play, in choreorobotics especially, are bonker-ballsly expensive and concentrated within corporate, academic, and military facilities requiring specialized access. Sorry, I inserted the word bonker balls for my daughter who's in the back currently raising the roof. Hi, Mika. They're bonker-ballsly expensive and concentrated within corporate, academic, and military facilities requiring specialized networks and institutional privileges as a precondition for access. My personal legibility within the academy, tenure, deanship, keynotes at Harvard, is a performance endeavor of its own, and I've activated my concomitant technocratic implication to further my choreographic practice. Implication itself is a productive choreographic interface. The text that helped me understand this matrix of relations is Brown graduate, excuse me, Anna Watkins Fisher's The Play in the System, The Art of Parasitical Resistance. Fisher argues that surveillance capitalism is so advanced, proliferated, and ubiquitous that we're all implicated in it. There is no outside of it. There's no turning it off. To greater or lesser extents, we're already jacked into the machine, and resistance is inevitably co-opted to its benefit by the Borg. Fisher points out that the word parasite comes from the Greek para, meaning alongside, and sitos, meaning food or a meal. She examines how the Commedia dell'arte character of the parasite, how it cozies up to power with flattery, wielding the resultant proximity for its own ends, usually like food, but more broadly, the parasite's own continuation. In classical context, the parasite has specialized knowledge, usually of a religious, moral, or artistic sort, that makes it somehow useful or interesting to a host. The parasite is, however, definitionally precarious, forever a guest in someone else's house, always on the brink of being asked to leave, forced to maintain a delicate balance of extraction and siphoning while playing the part of esteemed and compliant guest. The host, despite their performance of hospitality, has limits. The parasite gets away with as much as is possible, but never more, because if the host begins to question the arrangement, the parasite's access will be cut off, and parasites can't live without a host system. The stakes for being found out are total. Parasitism, then, as a mode of resistance to corporate capitalism specifically, or hegemonic power broadly, is always politically ambivalent, delicately situated, necessarily subtle, and always already incomplete, in that in the long term, resistance inevitably benefits the host. But in the short term, there's a bit of slack. Reaction time is a factor. Until the host responds by reflexively shutting down and expelling the parasite, there's a tiny window for play. Simultaneously siphoning while sustaining the host system necessitates the parasite's artful management of implications across performative, spatial, and chronological dimensions, a dance of willful misappropriation across space and time. Who was the most successful at this play of surfaces? In Fisher's view, artists, who arguably have the most latitude to wield their implications to creative effect. After all, the history of the Western performance tradition, dance especially, is a history of doing whatever it takes to keep the lights on. We begin again. I began studying choreorobotic performance in earnest in 2018, when Boston Dynamics released Uptown Spot, a music video of their quadrupedal dog robot, Spot, grooving to a cover of Bruno Mars and Mark Ronson's Uptown Funk. Today, Boston Dynamics is one of the most advanced robotics companies on the planet. Think Cyberdyne Systems, but based in Waltham, Massachusetts, and owned by a Korean conglomerate, Hyundai. The company was founded in 1992, when Mark Raybert, then a professor at MIT's Media Lab and founder of the LEG Lab, true story, spun off his grants from the Department of Defense to hang out his own shingle, Boston Dynamics. By the time he released Uptown Spot some 25 years later, I understood the company to be a military robotics contractor in the tradition of Terminators 1 through 6 and Ghosts in the Shell 1 through 8. As such, I had no reason to expect that the company would produce music videos featuring AI-powered robots bippity-boppity-booping through a potpourri of dance techniques sourced from the black dance vernacular. In Uptown Spot, we observe a quadruped twerking, doing the running man and two-step, all performed with rhythmic precision to a track sung by a man of color, written by a white British dude about selling cocaine in Harlem. I want to note that these aren't just appropriative choreographic choices manifested exclusively at the level of YouTube performance. These dance techniques have been lifted out of cultural context and encoded at the level of software and interface. The twerk, for example, is an Africanist and African-American movement technique that contemporarily gained prominence in New Orleans in the 90s and has since been a staple of hip-hop and femme black dance performance. The choreographic interface governing Spot's motion planning defines a twerk as a motion which, quote, lowers the robot, pause for laughter, down and back up once, end quote. An end user can select how much to lower the robot, but according to the interface, the movement can only last one beat of a 4/4 meter, and even then only within certain tempos. The robot thus aims to perform a black-coded movement, but without the possibility of rhythmic complexity and exclusively on a basic 4, the Miley Cyrus of time signatures. When this was first released, it wasn't clear if it was a joke, an elaborate ruse, orchestrated to trigger snowflakes, such as myself, into applying critical race theory onto a war machine apparently capable of bringing the funk. I was fascinated by this vexing performance and wanted to know more about how such a William Gibson fever dream could also somehow be real. So I sent a cold email to info@bostondynamics.com, not really expecting a response, to the effect of, "Hi, I'm a choreographer, and you're a military robotics company. Literally, what are you doing?" Minutes later, I got an email back from Mark Raybert saying, quote, "We want to do more dancing steps, more types of robots, multiple robots dancing together, robots and people, and perhaps some big production videos. Do you know any choreographers in the Boston area who might want to work with us?" Uptown Spot was a seemingly sudden, mega-viral success predicated on years of aesthetic experimentation that placed military tech in dancerly performance contexts vis-a-vis quasi-music videos. Absent that knowledge, one could watch this without discerning it was the outdraft of millions of defense dollars and conservative ideological posturing. The prior art, however, is significantly less subtle. In 2009, Boston Dynamics released a YouTube video called Big Dog Reflexes, featuring their DARPA-funded couple's Halloween costume-looking spot antecedent getting kicked around a parking lot. The sound is intermittently and theatrically slowed and distorted, with ironic floral top notes of 80s horror VHS tapes. The whine of the robot's gas-powered go-kart engine distended into a Hellraiser mule. Big Dog Reflexes kicked off, as it were, pause for laughter, a now established representational trope, wherein the resilience of Boston Dynamics robots is demonstrated by just really kicking the shit out of it. 2 years later, the company released a compilation video of Big Dog's progress, accompanied by a strange bauble of a blues song called Let the Big Dog Eat. The lyrics to this particular rendition begin with, "Way over yonder in the Middle East, they've sure got a big dog, he's quite the beast. Nowhere to hide and nowhere to run, when he blows you to kingdom come." Lots of people have recorded this song. Most of them tastefully abstain, from the fervid Orientalist fantasy of Middle Eastern violence part. This version was sung by the almost famous brother of James Taylor, Alex Taylor, and was produced by King Snake Records, which in the 90s was a small independent label in Sanford, Florida. You might have heard of Sanford. It's where Trayvon Martin was murdered by George Zimmerman. In fact, King Snake Records was located just 5 minutes away from the scene by car. Meanwhile, the phrase, "let the big dog eat," entered the popular discourse briefly when Florida man Jeb Bush, 2010 visiting fellow of the Harvard Kennedy School and self-dick stapler of a 2016 Republican presidential candidate, in a moment of dukakisy and flair, summed up his tax policy as, quote, "let the big dog eat." Nobody outside of Florida knew what the fuck he was talking about, and he has since retired from public life. Let the Big Dog Eat, sung alongside abundant representations of military accoutrement ranging from camo to V-22 Ospreys, squarely situates this media within a matrix of colonial orientalizing ideologies while evidencing audience-oriented, if still nascent, choices pertaining to musicality, sound design, and even costuming. I read Big Dog Evolution as a proto-music video of sorts, and while the eponymous Big Dog performs less overt dancerly material here than in Uptown Spot, the robot's movements through space and time teem with political signposting, representational flexes that grew subtler as Boston Dynamics messaging matured and they moved towards a mass market. Between Big Dog Reflexes, and Uptown Spot, Boston Dynamics quadrupeds miniaturized, went electric, and were made semi-autonomous via AI. Meet Spot. In 2019, Boston Dynamics started selling them to just about anyone with a spare $75,000, give or take another 100 or 200 Gs for sensory packages and robotic arms. The company has maintained its military contracts while leaning into the big 3Ds of robot jobs, anything dull, dirty, or dangerous. For example, Spots have been deployed at Chernobyl and Fukushima, cementing one of Boston Dynamics' preferred narratives. Spot is tiny, agile, and artificially intelligent. It excels at sensing and surveillance and is the perfect substitute for people in work contexts where you wouldn't want to send a real human. This logic informs Spot's deployments in policing contexts, such as when cops send them in to defuse such tense situations as in Hollywood, California, when an armed man refused to get off of a bus, or in Houston, Texas, where a naked armed man dragged a Spot into a hotel room. Better the robot than a police officer, or, a counselor, or mental health practitioner, or gun control, I guess. Cops trebucheting robots into the danger zone results nonetheless in predictably racist and classist outcomes. In the fall of 2020, a Spot was deployed in the historically black neighborhood of Cypress Hill in Brooklyn to resolve a parking dispute. In February of 2021, a Spot was deployed in the historically black neighborhood of Wakefield in the Bronx to investigate a home invasion. And in April of that same year, a Spot was deployed into a public housing complex in Manhattan to investigate a domestic dispute. The resulting citizen anger can be understood in the immediate historical context of, among other things, horrific racial disparities in COVID healthcare outcomes and the trial of Derek Chauvin for his murder of George Floyd amidst violent suppression and surveillance by police of Black Lives Matter protests all around the country. the NYPD Spot deployments became an object lesson in cops and Boston Dynamics' collective striving for innovation at the intersection of anti-Black surveillance and class struggle.
I'm back to let you know I can really shake them down.
No matter how virtuosic their renditions of the Black social dance vernacular, no matter how well the robots funked it up, discoed, did the twist or the mashed potato, none of it allayed the irresolution of Boston Dynamics robots being representationally enveloped in blackness, all while being martially deployed against Black communities. This music video is set to the Contours Motown classic, Do You Love Me? And begins with a Boston Dynamics Atlas robot pointing to the camera as though to gesture towards and implicate the viewer in response to the question posed by the lyrics, Do you love me now that I can dance? Titled, Do You Love Me? This media was released in late December of 2020, just as the NYPD deployments of Spot were hitting the mainstream press. The question, Do you love me now that I can dance? Reads as an admission of sorts, an ironic insecurity on the part of a military-adjacent robotics manufacturer, self-effacing tactical bot face for the sake of PR spin. The sheer racist face punchability of the situation was perhaps best summarized by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Quote, now robotic surveillance ground drones are being deployed for testing on low-income communities of color with under-resourced schools. AOC's read rhymes with Simone Brown's Dark Matters on the surveillance of blackness in its historicizing of surveillance technologies perfected in anti-Black contexts from the Triangle Trade to the TSA. AOC also echoes Ruha Benjamin's race after technology and her pronouncement that, quote, Black folks live in the future, as in the future is dangerous for Black folks, but the danger eventually knocks for us all. The NYPD Spot deployments resulted in fierce backlash from local policymakers and activist artists. At about the same time as AOC's comments, a collective founded by Brown graduates, Mischief, released a virtual experience titled Spot's Rampage. The work featured a Spot with a .68 caliber strap-on paint gun and gamified controls enabling random website visitors to puppet the robot at 2-minute intervals. The Spot's puppeteers then proceeded to destroy a white box gallery space filled with representations of Warhol's Brillo boxes and Duchamp's bicycle wheel, amidst remixed brand markings of arms manufacturers Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. Spot's installation, amidst loud signifiers of ironic art history, then juxtaposed against the iconography of the American military-industrial complex, accessibly situated Spot as found art of war for a popular audience. I'm particularly interested, however, in the choreographic interface undergirding all of this. This software enabled a global gaggle of internet users to pilot Spot's movement and weaponry, underlining AOC's point that the robot is a ground drone, a cute tank, really, best understood as an instrument of class warfare that ultimately destroys whatever context it's placed within. Spot's Rampage crucially distributed users' implication in the ensuing maelstrom. Piloting Spot was fun, a fortnightization of art history as mediated by a robot going apeshit in Brooklyn. Our collective entanglement in choreorobotic violence made briefly hilarious, until it got shut down by Boston Dynamics, who had, and I'm thinking again of Roach here, aesthetic, as in ideological, concerns for what gets to be art or not, what art is allowed to do or not, and therefore what art should be permitted to exist or not. Quote, we condemn the portrayal of our technology in any way that promotes violence, harm, or intimidation. Provocative art can push useful dialogue about the role of technology in our daily lives. This art, however, fundamentally misrepresents Spot and how it is being used to benefit our daily lives. It's hard to know exactly what happened next. Mischief claims Boston Dynamics used a backdoor to remotely brick their Spot, which is certainly possible from a technical perspective, if ultimately unprovable. Either way, with Spot apparently deactivated, Spot's rampage was over, until it wasn't. Mischief then loaded up Spot's carapace with just giant guns and displayed the sequel to Spot's Rampage titled Spot's Revenge at the Periton Gallery in the Gangnam district of South Korea, about a 20-minute bus ride and a middle finger's distance from Hyundai's global corporate headquarters in Seoul. The backdoor deactivation of Spot's Rampage demonstrates the asymmetric black-boxed matrix of power that choreorobotic performances navigate. Parasitism, it turns out, goes both ways. Spot's rampage got shut down because it pissed off Boston Dynamics, but specifically because the company maintains means of controlling its products even when they're notionally piloted by others. Parasitic manipulation of a host via a previously unknown and undisclosed virtual umbilicis lurking in the hardware. Any art deploying robotic components is subject to terms of service and use as interpreted by the manufacturer, thus requiring artists continuing implication within and negotiation of a corporate legal framework. The withdrawal of host and manufacturer support usually means an end to the art, except that was surely mischief's tactical intention all along. Spot's rampage triggered an allergenic response from Boston Dynamics that, continuing the logic of Fisher's play in the system, demonstrated the conditional edges of the company's supposedly innovative culture and corporate hospitality. The friendly neighborhood transnational AI and robotics company just couldn't metabolize the performance and thus had to expel it, inadvertently sustaining the very choreorobotic project they tried to quash. Tweeting jeremiads about the proper role of creativity in society while trying to kill some art made the company's hypocrisy plain. Between lousy press coverage of the spots in New York and pressure from the Brown University alumni weird art community, the NYPD pulled the plug on the partnership with Boston Dynamics in April of 2021, almost exactly 3 years ago to the day. John Miller, the NYPD's then Deputy Commissioner for Intelligence and Counterterrorism, complained that Spots had become a target for improper arguments about race and surveillance. Quote, people had figured out the catchphrases and the language to somehow make this evil, he told the New York Times. The Spots were deactivated and returned to Boston Dynamics, and Spots' tenure in New York City was over. Until it wasn't. Last year, Mayor Adams hosted a press conference in Times Square to announce that he was letting Spot, quote, out of the pound, and that the robots would rejoin the New York Police Department's menagerie. Throughout the demonstration, for a fawning audience of police and press, Spot danced. We begin again. One of the platforms I've been researching from a choreorobotic perspective is Apollo, a robot intended for eventual deployment in space missions by frequent NASA collaborator Apptronik. A few weeks ago at South by Southwest, Apollo premiered a dance derived from movement training data extracted from YouTube videos by Czech Nigerian choreographer Yemi A.D. This choreographic method, feeding a generative system dancerly motion capture data, is, perhaps predictably, yet another means by which choreorobotic systems are compelled to appropriate and perform blackness. And that's Yemi right there, grooving superiorly alongside his own choreorobotic doppelganger. Apollo, by the way, is the bipedal robot most likely to be sent by NASA to the moon. I've been thinking a lot about outer space lately. Choreographers, of course, are trained to think about how human movements through space and time create meaning, but not just any space and all time, terrestrial space and sublunary time. On Earth, space and time maintain a proportional relationality grounded in our kinesthetic experience of Earth's gravity. Most of our bodies know what it feels like to roll down a hill, to sit in a theater, or to drive a car. We hold proprioceptive sensing of these things in common. Human culture perpetuates difference, but what we share with almost absolute uniformity is the experience of being pulled downward at a rate of 9.8 meters per second. Our bodies, our theater, all of dance history, all creative production, the entirety of our understandings of the social and the civil are predicated on living on this planet as orbited by our moon as we circle our sun. What we call culture is made possible by having physics in common. Now, our conception of relativity and the interstellar, meanwhile, braids space and time into space-time. And out there, the absence of uniform gravity suggests new dimensions to the experience of embodiment and an unevenly distributed phenomenological understanding of our most basic societal premises. Out there, our bodies will exist across a brain-melting matrix of time-dilated relativities, wheres and whens, thens and theirs, nows, histories, and futurities, all of which profoundly flummox terrestrial means of creative production. So perhaps we can imagine cerebrally, sort of, the distances, scales, and embodied phenomena required for the maintenance of life off Earth. We can do math, we have models. Science is real, we have the technology. But our bodies have no lived comprehension of a void made up more of time than space, and there's a lot of space, and it's all trying to murder you. Navigating these intense spans of space-time requires our bodies being homed exclusively within suits, space stations, and shuttles. Somewhat like their simpler antecedents, cars, these media are inordinately complex computational, surveillance, and robotic apparatuses with deep investments in human signification, embodiment, artificial intelligence, and interfaciality. Next-generation space stations are basically just giant Voltron robots pumped full of oxygen that we populate with our bodies in a microcosmos of the social. As such, I posit that that physiological and especially cultural survival in space will be predicated on choreorobotic theory and practice. Now, in a Marshall McLuhan-y sense, I'm sure we'll go through a period of skeuomorphic cultural production that leverages terrestrial creative modes as we venture into space. The dance of the future will, for a while, probably look like the dance of the before times, just with less gravity. We will absolutely do space ballets and space painting and space Shakespeare, and generally plug and play creative modes from Earth into the vacuum. But out there, normative earthbound performance architectures like theaters are completely implausible. The maintenance of social ties requires common culture and shared means to make meaning. And to navigate the interstellar, to live in space, to inhabit other planets, we have to conduct technological research encompassing cultural, aesthetic, and performance inquiry. To understand what life is out there, yeah, we'll need scientists, but we'll also need artists, dancers, and choreographers who can ascertain the creative opportunities uniquely afforded us by space-time. Science will tell us what it is, but artists will tell you what it means. At Brown, we're planning a microgravity choreorobotics initiative to think about the relationship of robots, performance, architecture, and the void, to imagine the aesthetic, as in ideological, frames required to consider the cultural dimensions of interstellar travel, performance phenomena governed asymmetrically as much by the physics of space as the geometry of time. I've also begun working with the folks at the Aurelia Institute, whose mission is to prepare humanity to become a spacefaring species. The Conference for Research on Choreographic Interfaces and our podcast, Dances with Robots, is planning an entire season dedicated to figuring out what it takes to send dancers into parabolic flights to conduct zero-gravity performance research. Practically speaking, this will consist of vomitously vacillating between 0 and 1.8 Gs, hurtling us towards outer space at 6 miles above sea level and at 400 miles per hour to dance in microgravity within 22-second intervals. Figuring out how to make dances in variable gravity 6 miles above sea level at 400 miles per hour within 22-second intervals is the most immediate next step in our choreorobotic research. Along with Aurelia, I've begun thinking about teaching materials for a next generation of skywalkers to think critically about the human-robot interfaces of the future as a precursor to considering the ideological, as in aesthetic, prerogatives of interstellar culture. We have to understand space stations and robots like Apollo as culturally situated objects that carry the ideological priorities of their makers wherever they go, be it Texas or Mars. The risk, as I see it, echoing Octavia Butler and Bell Hooks, is that if we aren't mindful of how hegemonic juices flow through these systems, we'll wind up with imperialist, white supremacist heteropatriarchy in space. At a contemporary moment of great investiture by offensively rich white men in the colonization of the cosmos, this seems like something we should resist with some serious fortitude. The Silicon Valley move fast and break things ethos can make this all feel like a very now thing. But there are useful torsades of history that hold choreography, robots, and space travel together. Consider Apollo. Naming this robot Apollo gestures simultaneously towards aeronautic and dancerly lineages. Most prominent, of course, is the nod to NASA's Apollo program, named for the Greek god of the sun and of the dance. Apollo 2 placed prominently in Western performance for being the nom de guerre of, again, the arguable originator of the balletic tradition itself, wait for it, Louis XIV, Le Roi Soleil. He would deploy Apollonian symbology as his personal emblem and propagandistic icon of the French Empire as long as he lived, and even beyond. The French military emblazoned the symbolic set on their cannons for most of the 18th century, concretizing Apollo's importance for both pirouettes and parabolic projectile warfare. The origins of space travel navigate nearly identical striations of power. One of the first attempts at escaping gravity dates back to 1783, when the Comte Antoine de Rivarol proposed to the Louis XIV-founded Royal Academy of Sciences two conjoined scientific ventures. The first, a globe aérostatique capable of being humans' first flight. The second, a humanoid clockwork automata, a primitive robot with silk larynx and leather lungs, capable of uttering in French what translates sycophantically into English as, "O adored king, father of your people, their happiness shows Europe the glory of your throne." Robotic performance and colonial imperatives go way back and meet at regular intervals over the next 3 or so centuries. The articulation of that history is out of scope for this particular lecture, but I broach it here with a note of caution. The chief strategy officer at Boston Dynamics, Mark Thierman, posted on LinkedIn a few weeks ago this image of Atlas robots performing tasks on what appears to be the moon, in context of a note of appreciation for Elon Musk. He said, quote, "At Boston Dynamics, we have explored the possibility of robots playing a role in space exploration. I believe that our humanoid robots could be a valuable asset in the coming centuries." Elon Musk, meanwhile, founded SpaceX to literally colonize Mars. So there's that. All of these projects are, on differing scales, ideological projections that extend robotic embodiments and hunger for capital and territory across time and into space. Consider then Apollo, a robot laden with history, setting the stage for a next generation of human-robot interaction and a likely kernel of space culture to come. Consider the clumsy processual mimicry of an artificially intelligent robot imitating the movements of its black progenitor. Consider this ineffectual denouement of a choreorobotic performance, a dance about the future of labor that devolves into glitched asymmetry as Apollo's 2 robot hands attempt and fail to form the shape of a heart. Thank you.
Okay, so we do have some time for questions, and I would just ask, I have a couple handheld mics that for the benefit of our online audience, we use the mic when asking questions or engaging Sydney in conversation. So who would like to begin?
Feel free to.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Is there a question back there?
Okay. Yeah,
That was just terrific. Thank you. Just such a sort of packed such beautiful punch throughout. I'm thinking around a couple of different ways to ask this question, but I was struck by in the last portion of the talk, the move to space and the extent to which perhaps more productive, more beautiful, more ethical, question mark, opportunities for artists to engage with robotic dance took place in space. And I wondered about the sort of skipped step of artists making such kind of work with robotics here on Earth. I know nothing about this field, so perhaps that's happening everywhere except in the slides of your talk. But I'm just kind of curious about what you think folks doing dance and robotics differently from, say, Boston Dynamics are up to, and if any of it's interesting or meaningful in our dimensions.
Yeah, well, it's certainly interesting. Yeah, I think I mentioned very briefly a number of choreorobotic artists, such as, again, Katie Kwan, Huang Yi, but also Madeline Gannon, Amy Leviers. There are many dancers and choreographers who work with robots, just as there are many roboticists that work with robots and dancers to make performances. I'm personally really interested in choreorobotics, terrestrial choreorobotics, for the absence of a stable aesthetic frame to understand how these performances are significant or meaningful. I have no idea personally what a good choreorobotic performance is, other than Beyoncé's, of course. Thank you. We're related. Yeah. I think I'm moving into the consideration of space in the interstellar because, from my perspective, it is the most thoroughly unregulated avenue for both creative expression, but also astonishing investment on the part of folks like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, among many others. We're at a moment, and I'm thinking here of NASA's Artemis missions, where we are starting to imagine what interstellar culture might consist of. NASA has hired a number of anthropologists and ethnographers to consider how the social exists off of Earth. And this itself is nothing new, but the amount of investiture and other companies and entities that are similarly performing this research has increased extremely quickly. And so I'm interested, as ever, in finding ways of getting dancers work. And so one of the initial catalysts for the Choreographic Interfaces effort at Brown, but also the Choreorobotics, also the microgravity Choreorobotics, is finding ways for dance artists and movement body artists more broadly to be compensated for their labor, for their expertise. For myself, I'm a product of the immediate post-9/11 moment and then the Great Recession. I'm deeply obsessed with precarity for our creative populations, and I'm thinking constantly about how embodied labor does or doesn't fit into the machinery of capitalism. This is where the parasitic mode becomes really useful, because what I don't want to suggest is that dancers and dance artists should just go dance with the stars, as it were. That was a pun I just came up with and deeply regret immediately. All to say that we're at a moment, I think, both terrestrially and in terms of next generation space shuttle design, where the architectures, literally and figuratively, of how bodies relate to one another are being designed. Those design processes are happening now. And I, for one, very much want dancers and choreographers and artists to be a part of those conversations, understanding that their agency and power is always going to be limited. But nonetheless, I think their presence holds power if within an ambivalent, potentially parasitical mode.
Can I ask a quick follow-up on that? So it's my understanding that, just from my own research on Silicon Valley, that pretty much always the cost of entering these technological spaces as an artist is recognition, often deep, sometimes total, of who you are, what you do, and you can certainly see that in some of the examples you gave, where Boston Dynamics is treating art primarily as PR for the sake of generating love. That I think is the sort of like the abiding theme of this talk, yeah. Right? But I would love to hear more about your experience or reporting of others' experience of how you contest that misrecognition. Like, you know, examples of what vision of art, its purpose, its value, have you been able to make legible in those spaces that doesn't make you unhappy? Does that feel right?
Well, unfortunately, the pre-existing condition is a deep insecurity and unhappiness. So that's sort of the prior art.
Controlling for prior unhappiness.
Okay, great. Controlling for narcissism, sure. Yeah, so you alluded to this in the introduction, right? My brief time as a visiting researcher at the Boston Dynamics Artificial Intelligence Institute. And so this was a moment of simultaneous recognition and inevitably ambivalence. I have, as I briefly mentioned, over many years been in relation to the founder of Boston Dynamics, Mark Raybert. We have been in many meetings together. We interviewed him for the Dances with Robots podcast. We have a distanced relationship, let's say. I was invited to give a lecture, not dissimilar to this one, at the AI Institute, which resulted in my being invited to be a visiting fellow. The term of that engagement was 6 months, and I was not renewed. And this is fine. This is good. This is for the best, I would imagine. And it's suggestive of the kinds, potentially, of ambivalences, not to say conflicts, that as an artist with an ongoing research agenda bending towards the progressive and the humanist, like my presence there was, especially in the context of the Dances with Robots podcast, understood as a quasi-journalistic venture that could not be trusted. And I understand that. I am not to be trusted. I get that. And so I do not begrudge the company for their ambivalence in my reception or for my not being renewed, right? But it's notable, for example, that one of the choreoroboticists that I mentioned, Merritt Moore, who I introduced to the AI Institute, is continuing to work with the AI Institute. She's continuing to make work and to collaborate with the engineers over there. And from what I can tell, that relationship is significantly more sustainable and longitudinal. I want Merritt to continue making work. I think Merritt is a phenomenal artist. I want all dance artists to get work wherever they can. But it says something, perhaps, about the scope of work that I was entering into in contrast to what Merritt was entering into. My work being, again, necessarily about storytelling. Merritt's largely being about making dances. These disparities are not unique to myself and to Merritt or to Boston Dynamics or the AI Institute. We see versions of this in any number of creative labs across the Googles and the Amazons, any space where artists are being engaged, often with great remuneration for the artists, thankfully, sort of, to perform their creative practices within and around and for the technologists at these companies. The ambivalences and the siphoning, the complexity of power relations there tend to be unsubtle, and they tend, in the end, not to be in the artist's best interest. To be clear, I'm not telling any artist that they shouldn't get work. That is not what I'm saying. Rather, getting these gigs comes with a kind of ethical, moral quandary, potentially, that I, for one, as a card-carrying MFA in dance performance and choreography, was not ready for, and thus have been investigating. So I think my eldest child, totally, I'm not at all concerned for this. This is fine. And then Mika, I promise we'll call on you next.
This could just be me being confused, but for all the things you could fling into space, why dancers for a reason outside of culture and making new jobs?
Yeah, that's a great question. Were you about to drop the mic? Oh, that was going to be very dramatic. Yeah. Fair. Yeah, so I think that's a good question. Like, why focus on dance at all? And so this is a conversation that I've been having in technology, like Silicon Valley context for a really long time. Like, why art? Why dance? Why performance? Who cares? And, you know, fair play, right? Like, I understand how, as unprofitable as my field is, of course, it is not obvious or inevitable that we would be invited to artistic or creative residencies or whatever at transnational for-profit companies. And yet, I think my understanding, my feeling, my hypothesis over many years has been that dancers, dance artists, body artists, carry with them embodied knowledge and expertise that is actually deeply valuable, period. And specifically valuable as we're imagining emerging forms of technology that interface deeply, surveillantly with our bodies at scale. And so my want is for dancers and dance artists to be in these spaces so as on some level to make better technologies, but also to register that these technologies are embodied whether they're external to ourselves or not. They are contending with ourselves ceaselessly and at unprecedented scale. And my thinking is that dancers, choreographers, body artists are able to comprehend bodies at any kind of scale in motion across space and time better than just about anybody. And so when we're going into space, there's a very similar kind of quandary. Why dance? Why art? Why performance? Who cares? I get that. On the other hand, when we're talking about the movement of all kinds of bodies through all kinds of space and many forms of time, I would venture that dancers and choreographers are uniquely situated, uniquely suited to understand that emergent complexity. So no, maybe dancers in space isn't the most profitable or like scientifically urgent or form of research that NASA is considering, though NASA, if you're listening, call me. Nonetheless, at a moment when we're considering how it is that being in space creates meaning, how meaning is possible out there, what life is like out there, I want as many artists in the room as possible. 2 thumbs up from my 13-year-old. A round of applause from my 7-year-old. Oh, I need to have more ringers in the audience. Thank you for your question.
Time for one more question, maybe?
Oh.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes, please.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
for this talk. You'll forgive me for the autobiographical place that my question is going to come from. We're talking about children.
Yeah.
I have two of my own. They're both right now obsessed with Pixar against my better parenting wisdom. And it was very interesting to see the performance of Luisa's song from Encanto, which is not my children's favorite Pixar movie. Their favorite is Cars right now. And you had said that this Tesla body is too unlike mine to create this kinesthetic empathy for that performance. I wonder if that performance had been it's a truck thing, perhaps it might have changed the outcome. But as far as kinesthetic empathy is concerned, I notice in my children that they are attracted to robotic things. When I first introduced The Wizard of Oz to my oldest child, he was not interested in the Scarecrow or the Lion. He liked the Wobot. Star Wars, they're attracted to C-3PO and R2-D2, which seemed to me, and I'm not a Star Wars person, to be very coded as white. But I am very interested in this line that we might draw at which something becomes kinesthetically relatable through empathy or not. Is kinesthetic empathy something that is residing in the body of the beholder, or I would love to hear you speak a little bit more on that.
Sure. So I should start by saying that metakinesthetic empathy as a theory has some pretty profound limitations, generally, right? So it's pretty intensely ableist understanding of bodies in relation, and tends to play into certain kinds of classist notions of what kinds of performances matter and how legible those things are, et cetera. So I just want to start by acknowledging that this form of theorizing is already quite myopic, as it were. I think the juxtaposition of a Tesla car and the Pixar film Cars is a really interesting kind of move relative to the design decisions that Pixar makes relative to the obvious/horrifying anthropomorphizing of these cars that somehow also have souls, ? And the giant googly eyes and goofy teeth somehow, ? The cars with the teeth, I don't understand the physiologically, I have a lot of questions about cars anatomy, perhaps. But the amount of design labor required to create a children's narrative centering these objects is pretty prodigious, it's pretty profound. Whereas the Tesla car itself does not lend itself necessarily to those anthropomorphizing kind of moves. You still have headlights maybe and windows. You can do some amount of projection, but there is no ready equivalent, for example, between a Tesla window and my arm, whereas in Cars, the film, there is a direct mimicry between their front tires and an arm, or a back tire and a leg. So the film is doing a fair amount of work to project the viewer into understanding these cars as having a vaguely humanoid embodiment. And this is in contrast to Tesla, which it's just metal and glass and whatever. I think ultimately this suggests, though, that lots of choreorobotic performance is going to be conventionally understood as boring. I think it's just going to be not very interesting, especially initially. I have a really, and maybe this is my own attention deficited brain speaking here, but I have a really hard time watching these Tesla performances, especially when it's just a single car. It's when it's a single car, there's music, and the windows go down, and the lights turn on, and the windows go up, and the lights also go on again. I find, and maybe this is me being sort of an elitist schmuck, but I find it difficult to appreciate that. And the metakinesthetic empathy, this allows me one way of understanding my boredom. On the other hand, I think there's an opening for how human dancers, again, like Katie, like Merritt, like Huang Yi, like Beyoncé, dancing alongside robots does offer interesting aesthetic innovations and interventions. Again, the car dancing itself, I'm not super interested in it per se. I'm more interested in what happens when bodies and computational systems like cars move in relation. That relationality is really complicated, and I'm super into it. Now, at the risk of being an indulgent parent for a moment, would you mind if we please handed the microphone to my 7-year-old? I'm not going to regret this at all. This is going to be fine. I urge your patience. #parenting.
So I'm a little bit confused. When you say you wanted to go in space, do you mean like you want to see what it's like, or do you think, or are you mostly thinking about space?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you for asking. This is Mika. Can we give a round of applause for Mika, please? Yeah, so when I say I want to go into space, which is 80% true, I want to do that maybe for two primary reasons. First, to understand just physiologically what it means, how my body functions in that space, what kinds of movements and movement-oriented signification is possible out there, because I don't know. But I'm also curious how performance works out there, up there. I'm deeply curious for what it means to have multiple frames, multiple gravitational frames at once. Like, this strikes me as like a really interesting both aesthetic but also like juggling problem. It makes me think about like the different forms of like math and notation, to say nothing of like the affective declensions that are possible in those kinds of sites. So I'm excited to move into space. I don't think it's likely that I'll go there anytime soon exactly. But as somebody who chases really complicated choreographic phenomena, it's hard for me to imagine something more complicated / dangerous than literally going into space. The last thing I want to just say here, I'm standing in front of you right now as a person at a lectern with parent knowledge and expertise or something. But I want to suggest, I want to say ultimately that all of this work is representative of a global gaggle of nerds that I have been blessed to work with over now many years. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't, among other people, thank the executive producer of the Conference for Research on Choreographic Interfaces and the Dances with Robots podcast, Ariane Michaud. I also want to thank Jessica Rako, whose theorizing in this area has been absolutely instrumental and has pushed the boundaries of how we understand performance relative to robotic enclosures. I want to thank Monsell Durden again for very charitably showing up on a Zoom call with me to watch robot dance for kind of a long time. This is all to say that a lot of people contribute to this effort now over many, many years. And so I just want to acknowledge that and be grateful for that. And also thank you for showing up today and not showing up to the Red Sox game or whatever it is that's currently consternating folks everywhere. Thank you.
Thanks, Iggy.
Thank you. Hey, good job. Thank you, kiddo. All right. That was a good question.